In this third lesson, we're going to take a look at the kind of good economists believe that radio spectrum embodies. Economists divide all goods and services into either public goods or private goods. We need to determine in which category radio falls. Every good or every service has two characteristics. It's either non-rival or rivalrous in consumption, and it is either non-excludable or excludable. Let me give you some examples to make this important distinction clear. This is a taxonomy of public and private goods. On one axis, the y-axis, we have excludability, and on the x-axis, we have rivalry. If the good is both excludable and rivalrous, it will be in the upper left-hand corner. And if the good's nature is not rivalrous and not excludable, it will be in the lower right-hand corner. But what do we mean by rivalrous? If the good is not rivalrous in consumption, we say it can be consumed by one person without diminishing the amount that other people have available to consume. That sounds like a very strange good. But what sort of good would we have if it's not rivalrous? Well, think of a situation like this. I'm on a boat that's out on the ocean, and I go by a lighthouse. I can see the light, and the light tells me where the rocks are. I know not to go near those rocks. Another boat also wanders by and can also see the lighthouse. But does the fact that they know where the rocks are and I know where the rocks are mean that there is any less information available for either of us? The answer, of course, is no. In other words, by my using the information from the lighthouse, is there less information available for the other boat? Of course not. We can both see the light at the same time, so there's not rivalry in consumption. That's one of the characteristics of a public good. Non-excludability is the other characteristic needed for a public good. Once such a good as a light from a lighthouse is produced, there's no easy way to bar anybody from consuming the good of the lighthouse. Consider a ship passing by the lighthouse again, and the ship sees the light, and that tells it where not to go. Rocks are here, don't go there. Now, it is relatively easy for the lighthouse keeper to exclude people who have not provided funds. Or is it? Say another boat comes by. Now, I paid for the lighthouse keeper to keep the light on, but the captain of the other boat chose not to pay the lighthouse keeper. Can the lighthouse keeper exclude the other boat from seeing the light while at the same time allowing me to see it? Well, that's not a very easy thing to do. The lighthouse keeper could turn the light off, but then neither of us could see the light. Both of us would run into the rocks. So the lighthouse keeper keeps the light on, and both of us can see the light. Neither one of us will run into the rocks, even though I paid for it and the other captain did not. The other captain has become what we call a free rider. Because the lighthouse has both the characteristic of non-excludability and the characteristic of non-rivalry, it's classified as a public good. The opposite of a public good, like the lighthouse, would be a private good. Let's look at private goods now. It will be the exact opposite in terms of its characteristics. A private good example could be a bottle of Coke. If you go to a vending machine and you buy a bottle of Coke, it is both rivalrous and excludable. This would put it in the upper left-hand corner of our diagram. Because you've bought that bottle of Coke, you can exclude somebody else from actually using it. It has the characteristic of excludability. You've come by it justly. You now have property rights to this bottle of Coke. But there is also rivalry in consumption. If you drink this bottle of Coke, then there's now no Coke left for anybody else to drink. So it also has the characteristic of rivalry. So it has both of the characteristics of a private good, excludability and rivalry. Now, in the upper right-hand corner of our taxonomy, we find neither private goods nor public goods. The collective goods, notice that they don't have rivalry in consumption, but they do have excludability. A good example of that would be a seat in a theater. You go to a theater to see a movie. How do you get into the theater? Well, you buy a ticket. When you buy a ticket, you have the ticket and you go through the gate. Because of this purchase, you're allowed to see the movie. Now, clearly there is excludability here. A person without a ticket isn't going to be able to get in. If you don't have a ticket, you're not going to be allowed into the theater. However, when you enter the theater, there are a lot of seats. But say that half of them are empty. Half of them are full. You sit down in one of the empty seats and you watch the movie. Is there any less movie for you to watch because other people are watching the movie at the same time? Well, the answer is no. There's not really rivalry in consumption. So by having one of the characteristics of a public good and not having the other characteristic of a public good, we have what's called a collective good, and a seat in a private theater could be thought of as a collective good. Finally, in the lower left-hand corner, we find almost the opposite case. We have a situation where it's almost impossible to exclude people, but there will be rivalry in consumption. We call that a commons. Let's take a look at how a commons works through an oceanic example. Let's say, for our purposes, that there is a portion of the ocean in which there are a lot of fish. It's going to be very difficult for us to exclude people from fishing in this part of the ocean. We would consider this non-excludable. But if everyone who fishes there takes as many fish as possible, there's going to be rivalry in consumption. They may actually take so many fish that they take out all of the seed stock of fish. In other words, the fish don't reproduce, and next year there are fewer fish, and the following year even less. This situation oftentimes is called the tragedy of the commons. The commons that we are talking about has rivalry, but lacks excludability. Now finally, in the lower right-hand corner is a public good. A public good, if you remember, is like the lighthouse. It lacks rivalry in consumption, and it lacks excludability as well. That lighthouse public good is much like what we see in radio spectrum. But the spectrum also shares some similarity to the commons and also resembles a bit a collective good. So where on the economic scale does the spectrum belong? In the past, we viewed the electronic spectrum mostly as a public good in the United States. But more recently, it has been revisited as a private good, but with some externalities associated with it. I'll explain what externalities are in our next lesson. If the spectrum is a public good, then you have to assume that it has both public goods characteristics, non-rivalry and non-excludability. In the early days of radio, there really was non-rivalry. There were very few people who were transmitting electromagnetic waves, so they didn't interfere with each other. As a result, they could all do whatever they wanted in the electromagnetic spectrum with little cause for concern. In the early days of wireless, it was also pretty difficult to exclude people from doing experiments. Anybody could do an experiment. Jerome Green didn't need to be licensed to do an experiment in North America because nobody was interested in electromagnetic waves at that time. Thus, in the early days of wireless, there was also non-excludability. Today, the most relevant question for us to examine concerns ownership. Should we arrange the spectrum so that we continue to treat it like a public good, or should we treat it more like a private good? In other words, should we or can we sell pieces of the spectrum? The answer lies in how we define the characteristics of spectrum, and I will discuss that in our next lesson.